Obscure world of parking. We use it every day, but have we really capitalized on the intricacies of our industry? In this podcast, the Parking Network will go behind the scenes and talk to industry professionals about all things parking, from the horizon of evolving technology and even stories of the old days. We hope to encourage and inspire operators and property managers alike to look at parking through a new lens. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Our Parking Industry Podcast. We are here for a 3-part series today. This first one is going to be a bonus episode, and then we will have 2 to follow. So be sure to come back and listen to those as we continue this conversation. It is a big one. So I am here with Clyde Wilson and Lee Thomas. We are all from TPN Consulting, and we are going to be talking about hidden fees. Now, this is a touchy subject. We know that this is kind of going to ruffle some feathers, but it's something that needs to be talked about. We need to bring it to the surface. And we know that parking is in a transitional phase right now. Technology has really changed what we see in the parking industry for the better and sometimes for the worse. It depends on which side of the fence you're on and which situation you're in. So what do hidden fees mean for our industry? How did we get here? What does it look like for the future? Do we have solutions? What can we do to do what's best for both parking managers and property owners? So it's a 2-sided conversation. Since we are in the financial and operational review business, we see both sides. We see what's good for operators, for parking managers. We also see what's good for property owners and property managers. They're not always the same thing. So how do we get to a solid ground where we can compromise on getting parking managers the revenue that they deserve for the job that they're doing, the customer service they're providing, while also getting the asset owners the revenue that they deserve from the asset that they're providing to their local communities? What can we do? How did we get here is going to be our first conversation. We're going to talk about the history, different types of agreements that are historically part of the fabric of parking, and then how we transitioned into where we are today. And then, like I said, our third episode will be closing out with some solutions and what we forecast for the future for hidden fees. And whenever we say hidden fees, let me describe that a little bit. So what are hidden fees before we get started? These are collected revenue that is not remitted to the asset owner. They are either known by the asset owner or they could be unknown. So these could be things like transaction fees, additions onto expense line items that aren't factual based upon real invoices. We've all seen them. We've probably all done them, but what does that mean and how can we do them appropriately and ethically? As we get started, Clyde, I know that you have been around for this transition, talked briefly before we started recording about the different types of agreements that have historically been part of parking. And many people are still in the industry that were around during the lease days. We're currently in the management agreement days. And then there was also something that is little known called concession agreement. So we're going to talk about the 3 of those. So Clyde, can you tell us about lease agreements and concession agreements?
Okay, so we'll start out to discuss those. The lease agreements were, when I came into the industry, the majority of the industry were lease agreements. And, again, I'm sorry, but you guys all have to put up with my history major time and the way I look at things. But in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, I didn't come into the industry until the 70s, late 70s. So I'm not that old. But in the 50s, 60s, when the parking industry really started, there were mainly surface lots because we were going through a transition downtown from the old downtowns, the old structures. Those were being torn down, and then newer commercial office buildings were being built. The leases, the surface lots, were all of this property downtown, and the people who wanted to start a parking business looked at that and said, I can put X number of cars on there. I can charge them $4.50. So I can make a $50,000 a month. I have to have attendance on there for 12 hours a day. I have to have insurance. I have to have other basic expenses. So my expenses are $7,000 a month. So I have an available for rent and profit of $43,000. So I have to decide how much profit I want to make, and I'm going to pay the rest in rent. And I'm betting my ability to look at a surface lot and say it can produce $50,000 and $43,000 in ability to pay rent and expenses. So I'm betting on me. I'm betting on my ability to understand the numbers. So by the time I came into the industry, the management account had already started, but it was very, very few. And the challenge was the industry at that time was made up of local parking operators. So that was a local business to them. So they knew how to do leases. But when you start trying to create a national parking company, you're trying to hire some guy in Oklahoma City who's never counted cars a day in his life. And unless you want to go spend 2 weeks with him on every time he tries to do a lease, you've got to decide whether you want to trust him or not. Well, we found out pretty quickly it takes a lot of experience to get to the point where you can do leases. So those guys really can't do leases. So the easy way to get new property was to do it through management agreements. You have no risk. You're charging a fee. There's a budget that says, here's what my operating expenses are. The owners are only going to pay me a fee. At that time, it was $400 and $500 and $600 a month. And if you wanted to grow, that's what you were going to do. And you had to figure out how to make a profit on $400 or $500 a month management fees. And so that's what we did. Well, guess what? Now all over the country, you have all the big operators are 90-something% management agreements. They have very few leases. There are still some locally managed parking companies that have a large number of leases, but those are the smaller ones, not the big parking companies. So there are some out there. How good they are at doing leases, based on what I've seen, they're better than most, but not at the caliber that you had to be in 1960 and 70 to be able to win leases. So all that happened was, and here's the real story. The real story is a transition happened. The same thing we're going to now. We have a technology transition that's affecting us. Well, guess what? We have the opportunity to let that impact how we manage parking, but we seem to be struggling getting there under normal ways. So all the move from leases to management agreements was nothing more than a change in times, more commercial office buildings, more parking garages on the surface lots. So it was an answer to the change in times. Well, we're at it again. I'll mention briefly concessions agreements that were very different. Concessions agreements were primarily done at airports, even though I did see them in some other places, primarily because this was during the lease era. But what parking company wanted to lease the parking at an airport that was producing $100 million a year? So who was going to stand up and say, yep, I'll guarantee you $100 million?
Yeah, $100 million 2 quarters at a time.
Yeah.
That sounds, yeah.
Sounds crazy. And at an airport, the parking operator, it didn't matter how good you were. You can't make more people come fly. You were dependent on the airlines. So to create the lease of that type of environment was a concessions agreement. The concessions agreement was, yeah, you've got $100 million in revenue. Parking company, tell me what it's going to cost you to manage this every day. All the employees, payroll taxes, benefits, costs, all the operating costs, telephones, lights, all this stuff. And you're going to guarantee me your expenses. So you're going to pay a percentage of the gross revenue. So a percentage of that $100 million, you're going to take it and say, I'm going to take 5% of that. And out of that 5%, I'm going to pay all the expenses necessary to run this airport parking. And whatever's left is my profit. So that was a concessions agreement, which was really put the parking company with risk. You really can't control revenues other than you can, because there was a lot of theft here. But they could control expenses. So you let them bet on their ability to control the expenses. You had 7% and you better hit it.
And we've seen that a little bit with incentive fees that are at some locations that are part of agreements. But I go back and forth on that idea. I feel like an incentive fee, or incentive payout or whatever we want to call it, but getting paid based on an incentive, if you go over this certain threshold of gross revenue, that I feel like that works well for an individual, but it's really hard to do an incentive fee for a group because it takes that whole group working together towards the same goal, and even up to the corporate level working towards the same goal. So the on-site people. So the incentive payout that are in some management agreements, it's a good concept and it's a good effort to try to go back to this idea of concession agreements, but I'm not sure it's as effective as concession agreements or lease agreements because of this whole idea of an incentive. So I don't know, Lee, what do you think about incentive, lease agreements, concession agreements, management agreements? What are your thoughts?
Well, it sounds to me like when we were in the lease agreement phase, the person who was on site or the group that was managing the parking took a big risk on themselves. Therefore, their performance and their paycheck depended on how much work they were willing to put in. So they could risk a lot, they could lose a lot, but also there was a built-in incentive to work really hard. So their performance was tied to their paycheck. And Ben, when I was a teacher, that was the sweet spot, is whenever you could match a student's grade to his actual performance. That was when I got the best bang for my buck, really. So I'm curious about, Clyde, would you talk again about when we were in that transitional phase in the 50s and 60s and we transitioned away from lease agreements to management agreements? Would you really clarify, like, what did we lose?
We lost a whole 2 generations now of parking operators who grew up not having to bet on their ability to calculate revenues. So they that was a huge loss. They were more important. They had a bigger responsibility to be able to take a client to lunch than they had the responsibility to produce higher gross revenues and control expenses. So we lost a whole generation of those people.
So it sounds to me it became acceptable to maintain a parking facility instead of managing a parking facility.
Yes, it did. And, there were, I have a story coming up, guys, and I can't help but tell the story. During the lease days, the emphasis for the parking operator was on paying my rent. So I'm going to make enough money to pay my rent, and I'm going to keep the operating expenses as low as I can to pay my rent. And the agreements weren't really written correctly. They were written more like lease agreements. And the building owners apparently didn't feel like they had the right to tell the parking operators that you have to maintain my facility. So I remember, and this was in the later 90s. Now, I'll throw one more caveat in that is important. I won't tell the whole story because everybody will laugh too hard. In New York, and we're still in New York, most of the agreements in New York are still leases. And the reason for that was a little different but the building owners looked at that. It was a cash business, and you had employees down there. And so the building owner said, I don't trust the management companies, the parking companies, to be able to manage their employees well enough to get all the cash in the bank. And I don't trust the parking companies well enough to make sure that the cash they do get in the bank, they tell me about it all. Give it to me. So the building owner said, we don't trust you guys, so we're going to make you lease it. You tell me how much you're going to pay in rent, and then it's up to you. If your people are stealing from you, your problem. So there's still some. So in the 90s, late 90s, Parking Network is doing a audit of a fairly large building in New York with a fairly large underground garage. And it was a condo and apartments on top. So we had people that lived there. We had a business there. So we go there to do the audit. And I walked down into the garage and had to come back up and say, I've got to find a flashlight. So I had to walk around New York to find it. Didn't have to go very far. There were plenty of them, to find a little store that I could buy a flashlight in, because none of the lights in the garage worked. It was dirty. It hadn't been swept in years, and the lights were not working. So I had to have a flashlight to read the tickets on the cars, because I couldn't read the tickets. And I have a high New York level commercial office building and apartment sitting above me. And then the better one was on every floor, because the valets would run up and down the floors instead of taking an elevator. It was faster for them. On all the floors, the fire hydrant, they had the fire hose in the glass box. Well, they had broken the glass box and taken the fire hose out and used it to tie around the door to hold the door on every stairwell open.
Okay.
So maintenance was a little different issue in the lease agreements of the time. And we did make a really big improvement in that when we moved forward into management agreements, because number one, wasn't the parking company's expense to maintain the garage, and the building owners wanted it maintained. So that was a big improvement. Revenue wise, I don't think we ever did the best as we moved over to management agreements. There was nothing like managing revenue then you're paying rent. And if you screw it up, I think I remember one of the first leases I ever did, and they laughed at me, but we did the lease. The first month started, and every day I had determined I need to make $2,200 a day in gross revenue to pay my rent and my expenses. So every day I would measure that revenue to see how close I was coming to making my rent payment. So that was, to me, it was important to do that because I wanted to know if I had not hit it right, what I wanted to have time to start fixing it to be able to make that rent payment. So, that was a different time. We move into the commercial office building time. We moved into high level property management. Property managers changed, buildings changed, the garages changed, the parking equipment changed. I mean, I can still remember the first garage I had that actually had parks equipment that I had a record of all the transactions. So the parks equipment changed, everything changed. So the management agreements changed. And I think what we're looking at today is something that should provide the incentive for everybody to relook at this. We're at another change. We now have things that we didn't have in the 80s, 90s, 20s, 2010s. We have things today we didn't have then. So we can manage garages better to a higher accountability if we relook at how we're structuring these agreements. And right now it seems like some of the parking operators have figured out, I can change how I'm doing this. I'm not really doing a new agreement, but I figured out how I can change this. And the building owners are not really looking at how can we change this agreement to be sure we're getting everything we can get out of this. I mean, what do we know today that lasts for 50 years without change? I don't know.
The only thing consistent is how inconsistent everything is. Everything is changing.
Everything is changing. So we've entered another period, and I think we've put the parking companies in a difficult position. I think the parking companies have been in a difficult position all along. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but we put the parking companies in a difficult position because things are changing. So what happens is all of that expense that used to be on site, because I used to have tons of employees on site, I had a manager on site, had a bookkeeper on site, all paid by the building owner, that's starting to move off-site. And we're struggling with how to account for that. So the parking agreements that I'm seeing aren't really addressing this, rightfully so. We're kind of eased into it. So it's hard to get agreements to change when you kind of ease into some of these changes. But we're at a time where we've got to relook at this. It's in the best interest of the operators, and it's in the best interest of the owners that we relook at how these management agreements are done. We may want to create a new name for them. I don't know whether we need to do that, but we definitely 100% need to relook at how these things are being structured today and managed today.
Yeah, a concept that kind of came to my mind is that the stakes used to be higher for the parking managers, and now the stakes are lower because they're just performing, and Lee used the word maintaining a garage. They're just performing the daily tasks. There's no high stakes to perform better. One of the things that I've wondered is we kind of talked about this at the beginning, but the way that these hidden fees kind of started coming into play were hiking up expenses. And so those were represented on the management statement, right? But they weren't actually factual to what the expense really was. And property managers, property ownership didn't really ask questions. They would sometimes here and there, but if the trend continued, then it was just a continuation of the trend, and so it stopped being asked about. But one concept was that parking management kind of started to all look the same after a while. Hiring one parking manager compared to another parking manager, it didn't really change much for your garage, except how much it was costing you as the property owner to have that management on site, to have that parking manager on site. So to differentiate themselves, did parking companies start to implement these add-ons to make themselves different from the parking operator next door in this management agreement style? I don't know. What are y'all's thoughts?
Which add-ons are you talking about? Are you talking about the current ones that we're seeing, or the add-ons that we've seen as we do leases where liability insurance is marked up above a number that's realistic and other fees are marked up? Those guys, I guess, hopefully somebody the listeners will enjoy listening to my stories. So I worked at Central Parking and was hired by Monroe Carroll, probably the top in the time I've been in the parking business, the top person in the parking business and the one most responsible for change. He's the one that realized I can't teach these guys around the country how to guarantee leases. I'll never be able to keep up. I'll have people out there making bad deals that I personally end up having to pay for. So we're going to switch over to management accounts. So while then in the process of doing that, there comes this realization that now the management account building manager is looking at your P&Ls and managing expenses that you're putting on those. And so they're line item expenses and they're covered in the management agreement. But what we realized was it was really hard for the property managers to manage individual line items. So, I rember sitting at Saturday mornings as a young guy in the parking business with Monroe talking about how to do this. And his goal was that if you were a manager, you had to make 25% more next year than you did this year. You had to make 25%. Well, 25%, guys, is a really big number to do every year. Oh, I can remember this like it were yesterday. So he said, well, here, I'm going to show you how to do this. Monroe started teaching us how to add in, like mark up the liability insurance, mark up workers' comp. We marked up workers' comp. We didn't do this very much, but we did. We would put people on the payroll that weren't there. And that's caused me some arguments because there was a level that I could, I think, go to, but that was above the level that I thought I could deal with. So we didn't do that in my territory. And there were other expenses that totally started slipping in to this so that we could make a reasonable amount. The reality is we weren't being allowed because of competition now. Everybody's trying to compete with us. I'm bidding on $500 a month management accounts. You can't make any money at this. So we started adding in expenses and marking up expenses, feeling terribly justified in doing it because the owners were trying to bid us out all the time to some bozo that would come in with low expenses. So then you've got all these guys that work for Central Parking, and I was one of them, that eventually leaves. And one of the men that was my boss 28, 30 years ago when I worked for Epcoa Parking, I was just on the phone with him a couple of months ago. And we were talking, and I kind of brought this up. We were laughing about it. And he said, Clyde, remember, you're the one that taught us how to do this. So those of us who were branching out from Central Parking were carrying this that Monroe had taught us with. So I feel terribly guilty about this. Promise everybody out there, look, I feel terribly guilty. But it was the way management accounts worked and still work today. Today, though, we're going into a transitionary period and we need to be ready for it. It's coming, but we're not preparing for it. Monroe prepared very well for the transitionary period we were going into in the late 70s, early 80s. But today we're not preparing for it. And so that's what this whole is about. This group of Parking Network executives are the ones that are looking at what we do out there in financial reviews, and we see it.
We do see it. Our TPN consulting team spent some time in a U.S. city, and we actually got to visit two facilities that have very different ownership and management and equipment. And we saw two very different garages. Krista, could you fill us in on the difference of the condition of those garages and the difference in the operations, and maybe even mention the revenue capture? What was going on?
Sure. Yes. So the two property managers were definitely receiving different products, and they were receiving those different products at very different prices. So if you were to, after we visited the on-site locations, if you were to hand me the two P&Ls, I would have had them switched based upon what I saw, my observations whenever I was on site, and how much it was costing the property managers, property owners to have the parking company in place. One of the unique things was that it was the same parking company at both locations. So that was very interesting to see kind of the juxtaposition of what was being required and asked of them and the standards that the parking company was being held to at those specific locations. and how if those standards that the property ownership was putting into place weren't upheld, how easily it slipped into something that was less desirable. And it could also be the support of the property manager. So was the property manager supporting the less desirable location as much as the property manager was supporting the parking management at the other location? I don't know. That's a relationship thing. So then you have to dive into that aspect. So um, it was very interesting. So thanks for bringing that up, Lee. But one of the locations, I dare say you could eat off the floor at that location. The other location, I would not. I definitely would not. The 5-second rule does not apply. With just thinking about that again, it's just parking, right? That's how property management probably thinks about it, or most people probably think about it. It's an auxiliary industry, but the standards and the customer service and the appearance, we have to keep all of that under consideration. We kind of tried to come up with a thesis for this series of conversations, and one of the topics that we really landed on was hidden fees are an indicator that the parking industry needs to modernize operator agreements. And whenever we zoom out at those two locations Lee was mentioning, whenever we zoom out the agreements between the two locations, again, they were the same parking operator, different property managers. The agreements were very different. There was negotiation happening on one agreement. There was support on the same agreement where the negotiations were happening. So it was a give and take, whereas the other one was just slap down an agreement. It had a very standard, not specific, low stakes type of agreement. So as far as hidden fees, the property managers have to be aware of the agreements that they're putting out to the parking managers. It has to be a give and take, right? So the conversation has to go both ways. And I think the conversation has to be had. So modernizing those agreements will reduce, in our opinion, will reduce this need to have hidden fees, because the parking managers will be adequately paid for the service that they're providing, right? The incentive will be there.
Right. So we're seeing these hidden fees. We're feeling like they're an indication that, yes, we are in a transitional period in the industry, and it is time to bring into the digitized world our agreements. And here at TPN, we want an agreement that maximizes revenue, but also maximizes operations, that manages the facility well and not just lets it rot to cement powder. And we would like to see our property managers and our operators to provide the very best service, and let asset owners choose management based on the quality of service and not just the cheapest management statement. So we have really high expectations here at TPN. Like, that's what we would like to see. And that's why we're producing this series, because we want to provide knowledge and resources to the industry to help the industry understand this high standard that we can work for, and it will just improve our industry and help us get out of this transitional period better.
Absolutely. So the fee structures that we're going to be talking about in the next conversation, that's going to be kind of the one that hits home a little bit. Those are going to be what we are seeing are impacting negatively the integrity of our industry and of the service that we're providing. So come back and join us on episode 2 of this little series that we're doing on hidden fees. You got to hear the history today about management, lease, and concession agreements, how that evolution occurred, and kind of what we're seeing in our current state, where now we are adding a layer of technology onto our parking operations, and how we can come out of it both doing right by parking management and doing right by asset ownership. So we hope you'll join us back on episode 2 and episode 3 of this series about hidden fees, and we'll see you next time on the Our Parking Industry podcast. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you very much.
To quote one of the greatest business minds of our time, Charles Munger, he said, "The best thing a human can do is help another human being know more." Here on Our Parking Industry podcast, we want to provide knowledge and resources. If you heard something that sparked your curiosity in today's episode, please reach out on our socials at TPN Consulting. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe and follow. See you next time on Our Parking Industry.